Hi, everyone. We're going to start getting started. We have 4 amazing panelists to dive into this topic with the very latest information, even new and fresh off the presses within the past 24 hours, maybe. I am going to get out of the way as the moderator for now because I think the most important part of this conversation is going to be the question and answers at the end. So we've got 4 speakers in the order you see them. They're going to introduce themselves briefly, and we're going to get through all of the talks. Save your questions, and we're going to hopefully have a big chunk of time to talk about it. The first 2 are going to introduce an overview of the topics we're covering in this part 1. Yes, there are 2 panels on the IRA, back to back, so buckle up. And the first one, we're going to dive into split ownership and a few other things, including the 1 megawatt rule. So I'm going to just, without further ado, turn it over to Jacob Goldman, who is the most exciting speaker on taxes. No talking him up, he says. I'll just let him speak for himself. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to come down here. The IRA is 2 years old. Come on, let's go. Woo! 2 years of IRA. Woo! If you want to connect with me, I have my QR code. That's the only, I don't bring cards anymore. So if you want to connect with me, you got to shoot the QR code. I'm going to talk just briefly. This is high level stuff. We're going to talk about, the incentive itself, the bonuses. Let's hear it for the bonuses. Woo! Come on. Woo! We're going to talk about the bonuses. We're going to talk about what is a single energy property. What is a single energy property? And then I'm going to talk about what's eligible on a ground source side. So last chance to get the QR code to connect with me. I don't have cards. Okay, here we go. There it is. All the different incentives in Section 48. You'll see ground source there. We start at 6%. We can go to 30%. We can go to 40%. We can go all the way to 50%. Anybody do a 50%er yet? Woo. I got 40. We got close on a 50, but we're at 40. But those are all the different incentives. So it's not just ground source. There's stuff like solar. There's electrochromic glass. There's CHP. And luckily, we have these bonuses. There's 3 different bonuses. The first bonus is the 5-time bonus. It takes your 6% and turns it into a 30%. So if you qualify for the 5-time bonus, and it looks like the arrow didn't function on this system for some reason. But you can move 6% to 30%, 5-time bonus. There are 2 ways to get the 5-time bonus. One of them is by being under 284 tons of cooling or 3.4 million BTUs per hour of heating. If your system is below those levels, you automatically get the 5-time bonus. The only other way to get the 5-time bonus is by meeting prevailing wage and apprenticeship. There was a session last night. Hopefully all of you saw that. But the only other way, if you're not a small project, if you're over 284 tons, the only other way that you can meet the 5-time bonus is by prevailing wage and apprenticeship. And it's not just the prevailing wage and apprenticeship of the install. This is an important note. It is not just the install. If there are any alterations or repairs over the next 5 years, those also have to meet prevailing wage and apprenticeship, or you'd have a recapture event. You have to, for 5 years, you have to send IRS telling them that you met prevailing wage and apprenticeship for all alterations and repairs for the 5 years after. So if you're qualifying for the 5-time bonus for the install, alterations and repairs over the next 5 years also have to meet prevailing wage and apprenticeship. Okay? Next bonus, domestic content bonus. It is a 2% bonus at the 6% level, but turns into a 10% bonus if you meet the 5-time bonus rule. So 2 goes to 10, 30 goes to 40. Okay? Domestic content. Ryan's going to have some great stuff for us. Ryan's going to have some great, hopefully, upcoming stuff for us. Domestic content right this second, kind of difficult to qualify for. It is doable, but difficult. 2 things. You need any structural steel or iron on your project. Any structural steel or iron on your project, that is eligible project cost, that structural steel and iron has to be 100% domestic. It has to be sourced in the United States, and it has to be manufactured in the United States. Just structural, though, okay? Manufactured product, it's 40%. You gotta be better than 40%. There is some rules for solar, wind, thermal storage that goes to 45 next year, goes to 50 the year after that, and 55 the year after that for domestic content. There is a way to read the law that for ground source it always stays at 40. It is my belief that more than likely IRS is gonna misinterpret that. And so they might have guidance that says you have to do 45, 50, 55, so you should be prepared for that. But if you read the law directly as it's written, it should just be 40% the whole time. But I think IRS, unfortunately, when they come out with their final guidance, they're gonna say 45, 50, 55, depending on the year you place it in service. So if you don't wanna be against IRS, you might have to meet those higher levels. So I just want you to be aware, but hyper-technically, ground source stays at 40% the whole time. Ground source stays at 40% the whole time. Next bonus, energy community. Woo! Yeah. Okay. If you're in a brownfield site, you're automatically energy community. All the other ones are mapped based. This is what the New York map looks like. You'll see the southern tier has some purple. Around Syracuse, there's some green. So the dark green and the green around that is likely a coal-fired plant that was closed. So if you do your project where a coal-fired plant was closed, that census tract and the adjoining census tract, you get the 2 or 10% bonus. What's important about the purple one is the areas where 0.17% of employment come from coal, oil, and natural gas, and at the same time, those same areas have higher than average unemployment. How often does unemployment change? Anybody? Monthly. It changes monthly. Does that mean this map is gonna change every month? Luckily not. Every May, they're gonna change the map. So that purple could potentially blink on and off based on employment levels. So if you're doing a project in a purple area, the way you lock in the energy community bonus is by start of construction. You start your project. If you start your project before May and you're in a purple area, you've locked in the energy community bonus. But after May, there is a chance that that purple area will blink off, okay? There is a chance that that purple area will blink off. The green areas don't change ever. There'll just be more green areas as we close more coal mines and as we close more coal-fired plants, there'll be more green areas. But the purple will blink on and off. Everybody should write down this URL. I'll just read it off to you. That URL is where the map is. If you shoot that QR code, you'll get a link to this map, and you'll be able to look at your project to see if your project is in the purple or the green area, okay? So that brings up start of construction. Maybe that's my other presentation. Start of construction. Just wait. The next presentation, part 2, will have start of construction information. Single energy property. Single energy property. So how do you define your project? And this impinges on domestic content. It impinges on energy community. It impinges on the 1 megawatt, the 284 tons, 3.4 million BTUs per hour. There are times where you have to add projects together. And it's when any of these 7 items, 2 of them are true, you have to add projects together. And you'll notice there is no requirement here for per technology. So if you're doing a building and they're putting on solar and ground source, you might have to add those projects together if they're on the same land, which they are, and if they have the same master contract. You might have to add the solar to the ground source project. Now, there are times where you do want to add projects together. So for example, let's say Walmart was doing some projects. If they did 51% of their projects in an energy community and 49% of their projects not in an energy community, guess what? Under the current rules, they can call all those projects energy community, even though they're not actually physically located, if 2 of those 7 things are true. So you have to. So sometimes you want to be a single energy project. Sometimes you want to avoid that. So how do you avoid it? Don't have the same contract. Don't get financed by the same financing. So those are some of the ways that you can avoid that if you want to avoid it. But sometimes you want to group projects together because you want to get an extra benefit. For example, domestic content is very hard for solar. So maybe you want to combine it with a ground source project where maybe it's a little easier to get the ground source to qualify, and then the combined project qualifies as domestic content. So there's sometimes you want to add them together, there's sometimes you want to keep them separate. And it's dependent on 2 out of these 7 being true for when you have to add them together and when you have to separate them. So what is an eligible project cost? What's the eligible project? So it's the bore field, it's the heat pump, but ground source is specifically advantaged. Ground source is one of the few technologies that's specifically advantaged in that distribution can also qualify. And I'm talking about ductwork, VAV boxes, air handlers, all the way to the diffuser, all that equipment. If you weren't doing a ground source project, none of that equipment would qualify. But you attach it to ground source and magically all that internal equipment, that distribution equipment, can magically qualify as ground source equipment. And you get a tax credit for that same thing. Now, there is something called the 50% cliff. It used to be a 75% cliff. It is now a 50% cliff. So it's important to know that it is no longer 75, it is 50. Let's say you have a project which is ground source and backup gas boiler. The ground source provides 80% of the annual energy, the boiler provides 20% of the annual energy. You can take the credit on all the distribution that has that energy in common, but you can only take 80% of the cost of it, the installed cost of it. So it's the equipment, it's the installation, it's the design, it's the commissioning. You can take 80% of that in that scenario. If you go below 50%, if you do a design which is 51% natural gas boiler and 49% ground source, you're off the cliff. None of the distribution qualifies. None of the dual-use property qualifies. That's called the 50% cliff. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our next speaker. So thank you.
All right. I told you that was a very exciting tax conversation, and now you know the 7 factors. And our next speaker, David Burton, is going to dive more into dual ownership and limited use.
Okay, I got to follow that act. I need some trick dogs or dancing children or something to keep up with that. So David Burton, I'm a tax partner at Norton Rose Fulbright. We're a large global law firm. I'm based in New York, and I work. Most of my practice is focused on energy tax credits and planning for monetizing those and advocating for those and defending those on audits. I do some geothermal heat pump work, but also a lot of other types of energy tax credit technologies. Unfortunately, I get the role of being the Debbie Downer. So you heard about all the adders and energy community and all the great stuff that's in the IRA, and all that's really important and really helpful, but we also have some hurdles. So I'm going to go into what those hurdles are. First of all, these are really only an issue if it's what we're calling a third-party ownership. So if you've got your own building and you own the ground loop and you own the heat pump in the building and the distribution and all of it, and you're taking the tax credit and you're doing direct pay or you're selling the tax credit in the transferability market, these issues don't come up. So these issues come up when you're going to own the building and you want someone else to own the ground loop, or if you're going to own the building and you're going to own what's inside the building in terms of a heat pump and the ductwork, et cetera, and someone else owns the ground loop. So I just want to be clear, but these issues are really about third-party ownership. So in some circumstances, they don't come up. So the first one is limited use property. That's based on an IRS revenue procedure that was originally issued in 1975, was updated in 2001, but without any substantive changes. And this is the very long standard. I think it's important for people to actually read these words, because a lot of times I think limited use property, it's kind of, talked about and nobody really understands what we're talking about. And it's kind of like a word of mouth thing of like, oh, there's this boogeyman out there, limited use property, but people aren't really sure what it really means. So we'll start with the second sentence. I'll just read the second sentence here. This requirement is intended in part to assure that the purported lessor, so the owner of a ground loop, the owner of a system, has not transferred the use of the property to the purported lessee, so the building owner, for substantially its entire useful life. In the case of such limited use property, at the end of the lease term, there'll probably be no potential lessee or buyers other than members of the lessee group. So it goes on, but that's kind of the key phrase. So what this is really about is, okay, you've got a ground loop system, and you're providing it to a farmer. Your farmer is your host and your customer. The farmer doesn't want to own it. Farmer says, I don't have any tax appetite. I don't want to deal with it. Geothermal company, you own it, right? And there's nobody around for miles, right? This farmer's got a big farm. There's no neighbors. There's nobody around for miles. So if the farmer says, you have a 10-year contract, at the end of 10 years, the farmer says, yeah, I don't like you anymore. I don't like this. Get off my farm, take your ground loop and go. What are you going to do with that ground loop, right? It's very hard to economically redeploy the ground loop. And so that's what limited use property is getting at. We tried to get, we advocated for a safe harbor. So I worked with Ryan and GeoExchange on this, and we advocated for a safe harbor. We'll get into that. And we got letters from members of Congress. Here are excerpts from two of them who basically wrote to the Treasury and said, please fix this for the geothermal heat pump industry. It's an important industry. This doctrine really shouldn't apply to it. Please fix it. So I'll just read the second one, Senator Michael Bennett's letter. So he said, however, there is uncertainty over how the IRS will apply the limited use property doctrine under Revenue Procedure 2001-28, the GHP systems. In order for a lessor to retain ownership of certain property for tax purposes, the doctrine requires that a lessor must not transfer property to a consumer for substantially all of the property's useful life. And the senator went on very nicely to say, please fix this so that it doesn't get in the way of the geothermal heat pump industry. And then a similar letter came from a member of the House. So we lined up these nice letters, thought, okay, we've got these powerful politicians supporting us, writing to the Treasury. Treasury's going to fix this for us, right? So no, Treasury didn't want to take it on. So Treasury basically passed the buck. They said, we don't want to get into this. You're Congress. If you think it needs fixed, we think it needs a legislative fix. You pass a law, you fix it. So Treasury dodged the issue and said, as you can see bolded there, this requires a legislative fix. We're not willing to do it. That is frustrating because for other industries, for instance, wind, historic tax credits, carbon capture, other industries have kind of issues in sort of the same, not this very issue, but issues in the same family of tax ownership and what does it really mean to own something and have economic benefits and burdens. What does it mean to be a partner? And Treasury could have said those require a legislative fix, but no, for those issues, for those other industries, Treasury said, we'll put out a safe harbor and we'll make the tax advisors comfortable that you've got a safe harbor. You can meet the safe harbor. You don't have to worry about this stuff. And we said, well, give us a safe harbor too. And they said, no, we think that requires a legislative fix. So other industries have gotten their ownership issues addressed through IRS safe harbors, but we were told we need a legislative fix. So that was frustrating. So this is still all pending. It's kind of unresolved. There is a possibility of legislative fix, but of course we actually have to have legislation that can pass, and we have gridlock, and my crystal ball is broken, so I'm not going to attempt to make a projection on the election, but I think betting on gridlock is probably a pretty safe bet, right? So we'll probably still have gridlock after the election. So a legislative fix may be a long time coming. Hopefully not. Hopefully we get it in the near future and it solves it. But if we can't get the legislative fix, then you got to think about this and one idea is to have the building owner own the whole geothermal heat pump system, the ground loop, all of it, and then do direct pay or transferability, and then you don't get into these issues. Also, you could do this on sort of a community basis where you have a geothermal heat pump serving a community, a development, or multiple buildings. And if one building owner says, "Yeah, I don't like you anymore, go away," you can kind of reroute it pretty easily to another building. So those are workarounds. There's other ways to think about this. So it's definitely a challenge, something you need to think about. Hopefully we get it fixed. So then the other issue is split ownership, right? And so again, we get into split ownership, and we have this example, and I think just the example is important to understand. X and Y own separate components of a geothermal heat pump equipment, right? So they actually put us in the example, which taken together is a unit of property. X owns the coils of the ground, and Y owns the heat pump. No Section 48 credit may be determined with respect to either X or Y because each owns a separate component of energy property that does not constitute a unit of energy property. So that's basically saying you got to own what's outside the building and you got to own what's inside the building, or else nobody gets ITC. Pretty frustrating because a lot of times there's regulatory reasons you can't own what's inside the building, or just doesn't, if that's not your, servicing heat pumps is not your business model. It's a very frustrating issue, but it's what we have. We have commented extensively on it. So GeoExchange has submitted 2 comment letters, and I've got links for them here. So in the middle 2, so we've got the initial comments, and then we did some supplemental comments. So those are in. I've got a QR code. You can scan that if you want, and then that'll take you to all these links here, and you can read all this. I also included, didn't talk about, but GeoExchange's domestic content proposal as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Ryan.
Thank you so much. And I think the sum of those 2 speakers was our intro and overview. You now know everything you need to know. And our next 2 speakers, last year's IRA panel, we called all the uncertainty and the work ahead of us after getting the tax credit, the work of winning. Ryan is clearly the team captain, and he's going to share, and our next speaker as well, paths to the win, that the next play. Thank you, Ryan.
And I don't have slides, but I'm just going to piggyback on a lot of what David said and add some additional context and also give some insight into what the future may hold. So I'm going to start with the most recent issues and activity and kind of work backwards from that. Jacob talked about the domestic content bonus. This has given folks, not just in our industry, but in many other clean energy industries, a lot of heartburn since May of last year when the initial guidance on domestic content was first promulgated. The guidance was based on existing domestic content requirements in Buy America, Build America, and other related provisions, but it added a new wrinkle, and that wrinkle would require a taxpayer who is filing for a credit on a clean energy project for the ITC to get all of the, not only the sourcing information of the component parts and pieces of the property for which they're claiming the credit, but also the cost of all those components. So it would require suppliers of energy equipment to reveal not only where the parts of their equipment came from, but also what they paid for it. This is obviously a non-starter in a competitive industry and market, and there was significant outcry about the unworkability. Fast forward 1 year to May of this year, and Treasury certainly heard the outcry and came out with additional guidance, which created a sort of a much more feasible, easy pathway to compliance with the rules and accessibility of the domestic content bonus. In the proposed regs in IRS Notice 2024-41, they created what are called safe harbor tables. And the safe harbor table is really a reflection of a eligible clean energy project. And it kind of breaks down the parts and pieces, the various components of a project, and it allocates cost percentages to each component. And so for a project owner or developer, all you have to do now with the safe harbor tables is to just simply run down it and say, is this part domestic or foreign? And if all of the yeses in the numerator add up to more than the threshold of the required percentage, you're home free. You can claim the bonus, the domestic content bonus credit. That's great if you're in the wind, solar, and battery industries for whom the guidance was prepared. But Treasury said, we know this just is reflective and representative of 3 different technologies. If you're not covered here, just tell us how we should do it for you. So we took that as a challenge and we got to work. We set about crafting our own safe harbor table. So we pulled together the manufacturers of heat pump equipment and in a very confidential fashion, we took in cost information for all the parts and pieces of their equipment. We worked with a number of design-build engineering firms across the country to ascertain their costs for components. We averaged these across all the respondents. And then we sort of normalized those costs on a per-ton basis, thereby creating our own domestic content safe harbor table. We submitted this back in July. We had a meeting with Treasury subsequently, and I almost fell out of my chair. Treasury they're usually quite stone-faced. They don't give you a good sense of what they're thinking. They were quite complimentary. They said, wow, you really worked hard on this. Great job. I was really pleased to hear that. We have some additional work that had to be done, some supplemental refinement to the table. It's going in tomorrow or Friday. David gave his blessing to it on Monday. Our DC team gave their blessing on yesterday. And so we are hearing that domestic content will be, there should be guidance coming out in the near term, and our hope is that we will get our safe harbor table. So on to the next hot topic is split ownership. David talked about this at length. I mentioned it in my comments last night. I'm so profoundly impressed and grateful for the outpouring of support back in January when we were rallying folks around this. And a huge thanks to NY-GEO for really hearing the call to action and broadcasting it widely to their membership and partners. We had over 150 commenters weigh in with Treasury, a wide range of stakeholders, everyone from clean energy groups, environmental organizations, to gas utilities, NYSERDA and others, all spoke out to say split ownership of geosystems is kind of a fundamental business model for us as an industry going forward, and we really need accommodation in the final rule. We're now hearing that the rule, it could be imminent. I was of the impression that they would be waiting until after the election. Treasury loves to drop things right around Christmas, and then they leave town and everybody gets to sort through it over the holidays. But it could be tomorrow. And I think we can rest assured that we've done a lot of great work. David spoke to the letters that went out. It was not only members of Congress, but recently Colorado Governor Jared Polis saw fit to issue a letter, and we consulted with his office on it. So we've pushed really, really hard, and I would say, I mentioned this last night, it is the 11th hour, but I always like to fight to the end. And Zeyneb did tell me right before the panel, they've heard a lot from you. She got word that they've heard from us, right? But, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And so if any of you who are working with labor groups, closely with unions, and might put a word in for us, I have some talking points, some boilerplate language. and the contacts that should be reached out to, but we need to do it very soon. Finally, I'll move back. I'll move back 3 years in time to when I started working on third-party ownership. This has been an odyssey. David said he told me it would not be easy, but I am always optimistic, and I still think there's an opportunity to get it done. We were initially so encouraged because we met with Treasury right after the IRA passed, and one of the assistant secretaries said, "Oh, this isn't a strict IRA issue." Well, we have the ability and the authority to see this through and maybe issue something. Well, that was a political appointee who was, thinking in line with the administration's climate goals. But when your issue starts to filter down to the basement of the Treasury Department, the crusty old bureaucrats that have seen presidents come and go get a hold of your issue, and they know what's best for the revenue code. So that's when things get a little bit sticky. But David said, when can we get a legislative fix? It's not easy in a gridlocked Congress, right? Well, what's going to happen next year is known by a few different terms. I've been on the Hill a lot this year, and everybody's talking about next year's tax Super Bowl. But the Super Bowl comes every year. It's more like the tax Olympics. People are calling it Taxamageddon, Taxapalooza. It's a major, major rewrite of the tax code. And it's happening because there are major Trump-era tax provisions that are expiring. And the parameters of this negotiation will somewhat be shaped by the outcome of the election. But regardless of what happens with the election, there will be a major negotiation because there are fixes to the IRA. There are potential additions to the clean energy provisions of the IRA. A lot of folks want extensions of the expiring tax provisions. We were in D.C. a few weeks ago, and we met with the Senate Finance Committee, and they are keeping a laundry list. It is growing longer by the day, and so our hope is that we can thread the needle. How do we do that? Well, it helps because it helps that everyone loves geothermal. And if you have bipartisan support for your provision, your initiative, you're much likelier to get the deal done. And that's the thing I love about going to Washington. It's not the gridlock, it's talking to members of Congress that are so pole opposites. They're so divided in most of their philosophies and most of their approaches. But they all love geothermal. That's the thing that we can really take to the bank, and that's what we intend to do next year in the major tax rewrite. So stay tuned. We're going to be calling on you all once again to lift your voices and weigh in, and happy to take any questions as the panel concludes. Thank you.
And our last speaker, Adam Shelly, is going to dive into a kind of third path.
Hi, everyone. Really excited to start at this point in my typical slide deck, because usually I have to start out by saying, okay, there was a big tax bill a couple years ago, and then start from there. So great to have it set up this way. I want to talk about something that has not been publicly shared as far as I know. It's a strategy that we use to expand the interpretation of thermal energy systems, or thermal energy storage. Why does that matter for geothermal systems? Because you can have two different systems that might be used together, two different concepts, to resolve some issues that you have, whether it's split ownership or some other concepts, but also an important theory when you're designing different types of systems. So as you all know by now, you can get tax credits for these different types of energy property. The red is highlighted because that's what we're going to be speaking about, and it's on energy storage, not geothermal. Very exciting for this conference, I know. Section 48, energy storage technology. Energy storage technology refers to property that is received, stored, or delivered for thermal purposes. That says electricity, but there's a different part that says thermal energy is also considered energy storage property. It needs to be at least 5 kilowatt hours in size. There's three things that define thermal energy storage. Number one, it has to be directly connected to an HVAC system. I think that's pretty easy for everyone. Number two, it has to remove heat, add heat, or store heat for subsequent use. The subsequent use is a key part. Number three, provide energy for heating or cooling of the interior of a residential or commercial building. So again, HVAC, not domestic water, not swimming pools. Everyone feel good about that so far? Great. It's good to see so many friendly faces in here. And by that I mean like awake faces. It's very exciting stuff here. So what is active thermal energy storage? A series of mechanical and thermal components that are designed to heat and cool as a single functioning unit. These are my definitions. Active thermal energy storage, and there is an activethermalenergystorage.com, is really a marketing term that I made up to differentiate it from traditional thermal energy storage. And when most people think of thermal energy storage, they're probably thinking of tanks, bricks, other storage mediums that are large in size. But this is the differentiator. Thermal energy storage tank is in the blue box, and there's a chiller connected to it. Run it at night, produce chilled water, produce ice tanks. What if I changed the tank size and had it be taller, and a little bit narrower? Still thermal energy storage, right? See where I'm going here. What if you made it thinner and had it have arms, like piping or branching or things like that? And then what if I added additional equipment on it to add heat, remove heat, or store heat? It might look like a building to you, and you would be correct. A case study, International Taylor Company building. This is a project in which we executed the transfer of a tax credit. So this is complete. This has been reviewed by insurance companies that have underwritten tax credit insurance policies. Opinions have been written by lawyers who helped to lobby for the original bill. Independent engineers have reviewed it. Cost segregations have been performed. This transaction is complete. It's a 180 unit residential building just south of Union Square. It needed a lot of upgrades, asset renewal, local I-97 reductions, needed everything. This was sort of the system, this illustration. Connected to it on the left-hand side are water source heat pumps in each unit, providing heating and cooling to those units. On the roof or in the basement, there are boilers, air source heat pumps, dry coolers, connected to different equipment. Everything is connected through this hydronic mitigated loop. Each piece of equipment is adding or removing energy from that thermal energy loop. And that thermal energy loop is storing that energy for use in other places in the building at another point in time. This is that building. This is the rooftop, air source heat pumps, dry cooler, completely decarbonized other than the occasional use of a condensing gas-fired boiler for peaking or backup loads. So this is active thermal energy storage. It's the whole building. You need to start in the design, you need to consider this, and make everything eligible for that tax credit. I haven't said the word geothermal yet, but it's coming, I promise. Assuming now everyone is buying into the active thermal energy storage concept, just by a raise of hand, who believes this so far based on the definition of thermal energy storage? Raise your hand. Okay, that's fine. This is pretty good. The first conversations I usually have with the big firm tax accounting firms, with the lawyers, with different clients, is skepticism, and that's extremely healthy. So that's good to see, but it's better feedback than usual. So let's say everyone does buy into this. That exact concept can expand to different campuses. You're connecting different buildings, you're exchanging energy, you're producing heat, you're removing heat from that system for subsequent use. That's a huge, huge differentiator when you're designing a project that's going to cost millions and millions of dollars. You can get up to 50% off, or 6 to 50, based on what you've heard. I like to go 50. It can also apply to utility scale systems. There's a lot of thermal energy networks being designed in New York right now. Consider thermal energy storage, not just geothermal, in order to get the tax credits for these type of systems. And you can really unlock a massive decarbonizing electrification concept in different buildings, campuses, or utility scale. So this link, this QR code, I saw their presentations first and liked the QR code idea. This takes you to activethermalenergystorage.com. It was the best $10 investment that I've ever had. It just takes me to like my company's website. Very exciting. But that's the idea. The way to connect it into the split ownership is to just consider different property, different equipment as thermal energy storage, not just as geothermal. Thanks. I'm excited to take all of your questions, although I doubt you'll have any from this very easy topic. So.
We did pretty well at playing musical chairs, right? All right. So I know you all undoubtedly have questions. For the record, I totally think that the thermal energy network is thermal energy storage. I just wonder about aquifer thermal energy storage and how they feel about your domain name. But the egg in the way, exactly. So I want to actually just turn it over to you for questions and see where the conversation goes. So I know there's a mic right here. So the only person speaking is going to be the person with the mic. Excellent. And you've seen both the policy path forward to the win and a third path through the thermal energy storage approach. There might be others out there. That is the long history of our tax code, right? All right, we've got a question.
Is this on? Oh. Matt Damaris from Energy Catalyst. I've heard different things over the years, and so I wanted to just get a quick question and see if I can get an answer on it. If there are state rebates that come on a project, so just for some really round numbers, let's say $100,000 project, $25,000 state rebate, should the percent IRA rebate, whether it's 30% or 40%, whatever it is, should that be taken off the larger number, the total project cost, or the cost after the state rebate or other benefits have been applied?
Yeah, it turns on whether or not you properly treat the state rebate as income. If you report it as taxable income, it doesn't reduce your ITC eligible basis. If you treat it as a reduction of basis, then it reduces the amount of ITC you get. Generally, the code has a presumption in favor of things being income. So usually it's not that hard to squeeze it into being income and not a reduction in basis, but you do need to work with your tax advisor on it. Adam's asking if I want to talk about subsidized energy financing. So if you have, that's tax-exempt bonds. So if you have, if you get somebody to issue tax-exempt bonds for you, that reduces, that can reduce your ITC as well. So there's a 15% maximum on that. So you start off pro rata, but not more than 15%. But that's for tax-exempt bonds, which are their own special issue. But good question.
Hi, Ron Kamen, Earthkind Energy Consulting. So, Adam, I love your idea about everything being energy storage. It's wonderful. I was wondering if we could have some comments from some of the other tax advisors out there about whether or not, first, this is tested, second, the risk if you do it this way, and the IRS eventually comes down and says, no, no, no.
But before they jump on, I'll say that I missed the prep call for this, so they've never seen this before, so I'm excited to see the friction that comes out of that question. So thank you.
Yeah, so I'm on the spot here. I think it's interesting. I think it's worthy of more, analysis. I'd have to do, more analysis and talk to my partners about it to get comfortable with it. But it doesn't. I'm not. I'm not saying, Adam, get off the stage. You're crazy. Like I think it's a contender. So it needs more analysis, but I think it's interesting. If you get it wrong. So let's see, if you get it wrong, the IRS is almost asserting penalties is just a matter of ordinary course. So like all the audits I have now, I had one audit where they were asserting penalties when they said that there was no change the next week. They're like, oh yeah, we're just going to let you go, it's fine. But I was like, okay, last week you said it was so bad you were asserting penalties. This week you're just like saying, okay, well, we're going to let it go. So the IRS is basically asserting penalties all the time, and the basic penalty is 20%. That's either negligence or substantial understatement, and they're very good at coming up with why you did one of those two things. And then you owe the IRS back interest, which right now is around 8%, and that accrues from when the tax return was due to when you resolve it with the IRS. So the interest can very quickly get to be almost as much as the underlying tax liability, and then a potential penalty on top of it. Interest accrues on the penalty from a day the IRS asserted the penalty, not from a day you filed or your tax return was due. So the numbers can get quite big. So it is high stakes. So you want to be sure that you get it right. Adam mentioned tax credit insurance. That's always a good mitigant to think about. That market's really grown, and a way for parties to limit their tax risk.
I guess the only thing I would add is a thermal storage system has to have two elements. It has to have a storage, and it has to be connected to something that creates the energy that's stored, and then it has to be connected to an HVAC system. There's something called a thermal energy system, and there's some other thing that has to exist called the HVAC system. So the scenario is very interesting, but there has to be something that exists called thermal energy system, and there also has to be something else that exists called the HVAC system, and those two things have to be connected. So how you define that, I think, is going to be kind of an interesting aspect of this. No, there is something called the thermal energy system, and there's something else called an HVAC system. By the way, thermal storage, ground source systems, they're like the cousin you don't like. IRS and Treasury have not given any definitions to anything, basically, in those two. And the same is true for thermal storage here. So it's going to be a long time before we get any sort of definition on this type of stuff. And it might take, an IRS audit, and then an appeals, and then tax court. Tax court happens, 5 years after? Sometimes more. So this might not be defined for 8 years or so. And there's going to be plenty of people taking the incentive, and they're going to say, oh, I did this and it's fine, it was approved. There's no such thing as approved. So you take it and you get away with it potentially. It has interesting aspects to it, just so you're aware. But there's a portion where the only way you don't get away with something is an audit, appeals, tax court.
To me, approved means that it's underwritten by the tax insurance company, because that means there's another entity who's reviewed these documents probably more than the IRS ever will, and that both the buyer and the seller of that tax credit are protected. So that, to me, was the huge milestone of this transaction.
Who knew the tax panel would get so interesting, right? I am curious, I'm going to stick in a question. Is there some benefit in that thermal energy storage play of the industry as a whole predefining what the boundary is between the thermal storage system and the HVAC system, as a way to kind of make it an industry norm that's defensible and not multiple submissions with different boundaries?
Yeah, I think that helps, but the IRS, the IRS often gives some deference to industry norms and industry practices, but they also have very clearly stated that they're not bound by it. So, it helps and it kind of pushes things in the right direction, but if the IRS is angry, they can be like, yeah, we don't care what the industry thinks. It's not the industry's job, it's our job. So it helps, but it's not a silver bullet.
Back to you.
Mike Bales from EnergyWise. My question is with respect to the domestic content provision. All of what we do typically is well below the 284 kW size that meets that provision. Who defines that content? How is it defined by, is it defined by the manufacturer? And once, let's say you have a specific manufacturer that says, yes, we meet those provisions, that immediately means all their equipment meets that, and therefore the client qualifies for this 40%?
So it's a math equation for ground source. There's probably 30, 40, 50 different manufactured products in a ground source project. So you're taking the percentage of each of those manufactured products times their manufactured cost, adding them up, and then dividing by the total manufactured cost to see if you gain above 40%. So if you get a heat pump that says they meet the qualification, that's great, but you still have the other 29 items or so that also need to meet it. So it's a math equation. We respect a letter from the manufacturer as the document. Oftentimes those manufacturers are saying things like, we meet BABA, we meet Buy America, we meet Buy American. If they say one of those three items, that's great, but when we do our calculations, we only take it at the minimum that's required by those requirements. So some of those have a 40% minimum, some have a 55, I think some have a 65. So we take that percentage and apply it against the costs, and that's all we can't make it 100% unless the manufacturer letter says we're 100% domestic. So I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I think what you started with your question about sounded like qualification for the 1 megawatt exception, and that's not domestic content, that's prevailing wage and apprentice. So if you're under the 1 megawatt equivalent, you don't have to comply with prevailing wage and apprentice, but that doesn't answer the domestic content. You could be under 1 megawatt, and to get domestic content, you still have to meet the domestic content rules. It's just if you're under 1 megawatt, you get the 30% without having to deal with prevailing wage and apprentice.
What we're talking about is much more small-scale projects with prevailing wages. Small residential and light commercial, 10, 20 ton max.
I believe the way that the domestic content law is written is that it's the Buy America qualification that you have to look at, and that certificate. And that's often quite a burden for projects, especially smaller ones, because a lot of manufacturers and fabricators resist following that the documentation requirements.
So it would be on the manufacturer to define.
Yeah, but you should definitely put it in your projects in the drawings and specifications, and that's true for prevailing wage labor. You got to get that information, those requirements, into the documents up front. Otherwise, it becomes a problem down the road during project implementation.
Hi, Jason Hertz-Durham. How you doing, Jacob? I just thought I'd ask the question. The dual-use equipment, there's just been discussions, I've been in presentations about whether it's total annual energy, is it just heating, is it just cooling? Can we have like a clear answer of what that rule is?
Yeah, I've heard this where people are saying it's on heating side only. I don't see anything in the code that allows you to just look at the heating side. I think it's heating and cooling, and it's annual energy use. What I will give as a little tip, there's two different ways you can qualify for the percentage. The second way, which is very interesting for a lot of hospital projects, there's a lot of hospital projects that require you to have duplicate equipment. There's a way, as long as you keep them that they can't run at the same time, that it's impossible to run at the same time, there is a translation of the code that you can count it as only one path through the equipment. You don't have to count the repetitive one if you design it so they can't both be running at the same time.
Good morning, John Thomas with Water Furnace. Thanks to Zeyneb and the panelists for making this a very informative and educational session. I feel like we're in tax court, so I've got a two-part question for two different people. May it please the court, just for a little levity. So Adam, appreciate your explanation of the concept of what you've got on active thermal energy storage. Is there any stipulation in the definition as you interpret it that excludes on-site combustion for heat?
No, not in Section 48. In Section 48E, there are some limitations as to emissions that could disqualify certain types of equipment. So that you'll have to look at, but there's nothing specifically excluding that.
Okay, all right, thanks for that.
Which is a problem, I think. Like if you just look at thermal energy storage at its face, you could have a gas-fired boiler and put a large tank in front of it, and that whole plant can be considered a thermal energy storage plant, which I don't like.
But if you don't start construction this year, you're under 48E, and you have the problem that Adam referred to. So, yeah, 48 may be great, but for geothermal heat pumps are different. But for energy storage, it shifts to 48E, and then you have the prohibition on emissions.
Oh, so there is a stipulation in 48E after New Year's Eve this year.
I would
that
disagree with that. There is no stipulation.
See, I thought I'd make some good trouble here. Go ahead, Jacob. Go ahead.
So the way they wrote thermal storage into 48E is it's its own section. All the other sections in 48E talk about what you're talking about, the greenhouse gases, but those portions do not apply to the section for thermal storage. It's an island on its own, and 48E, the name of 48E is Clean Electricity ITC, and thermal storage clearly is not an electricity generator. It was just picked whole cloth from 48 and dropped into 48E. So in my reading, it does not have to meet those greenhouse gas requirements. It was just dropped whole cloth.
So I know we could keep, you have one more, sorry, John Thomas.
Yeah, if I could.
Go for it.
Okay,
We
the
have
next
like
one will be
minute.
easier. I apologize to the audience because now we're all a little bit more confused about active thermal energy storage. But there's pending things coming up, I think, is the takeaway there. And the fact there's different opinions is healthy. My next one is a little more specific, David Burton, and that is back to your Farmer Brown scenario on limited use property assets. So if you're Farmer Brown and I'm Geo Johnny, and I put the loop in for you, the limited use property asset doctrine is specific about, does the Geo Johnny asset have an alternative future use that's practical to another customer, correct?
Correct.
And that's why you use the Farmer Brown scenario. Right. So if I'm Geo Johnny, I put the loop in, I got a 20-year contract with you, you're Farmer Brown. In the eyes of the IRS, who actually owns the loop? If I can't own it, who does?
Yeah, it's not binary, so it's frustrating. There's a lot of these tax doctrines are like, okay, well, if I trip that rule, then the answer must be the other guy. But very rarely, then the IRS will say the other guy, well, he doesn't have title, he doesn't have to insure it, he doesn't have risk and reward, so he doesn't own it either. So then it kind of is like, oh, nobody owns it, nobody gets the tax credit, which is what they're saying about split ownership, which is sort of a cousin of limited use. So, I wouldn't be confident that the farmer owns it either.
So Farmer Brown can't apply for the tax credit, or they could, but they will get a ruling on it.
Yeah, they probably would get resistance from the IRS on that. The IRS will say nobody's got enough of the right attributes to own it. It's frustrating. It should be, you'd think it would be one or the other. But
okay, so thanks for that perplexing answer that we have a ground loop that is a hard asset that actually nobody owns.
Owns for tax purposes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Well,
great.
that's
I
a
think.
great.
Permission to treat you as a hostile witness. No, I'm just kidding.
That's a great lead-in to the fact that we have a second panel on the IRA after the break, so we can actually keep the conversation going. Clearly, it's hard to cut us off, but it is time, and I want to just give the panelists a moment. Ryan, do we have an ask for the audience going forward, or are we all just crossing our fingers and hoping?
If you are close to trade unions or labor organizations that are getting involved in the thermal energy network space, come talk to me. I want to give you some ammunition to make a last-ditch effort before the rule is issued. I'll also say stay tuned for next year. The Tax Olympics are coming, and it's going to be fun, and you'll be hearing from me.
All right, that's the end of our very exciting tax panel. Thank you.
So the next session is at 11:45 in this room and other places. It's not really a continuation exactly. We're going to focus on two topics, transferability and elective pay. Those are going to be the focus items for next session.